Thursday, 7:10 p.m. A text slides in like a knife under a door. Borrowing that old blue pin for the gala. Hope that's okay. Not a question. An announcement. I set the phone down on my kitchen table, the oak one my husband built, and dial my attorney. Ava, it's Ellie. File the theft report on asset G042. Tiffany Sapphire, 1905. Insured at $2.1 million. She's wearing it right now. Fox Run Country Club. Silence. One breath. Then Ava's voice turns to steel. Calling the insurer and DuPage County. Stay put. Sergeant Park will confirm. I boil water for tea. My hands don't shake. Because borrowed without permission has another word, stolen. The house creaks, the phone rings. Mrs. Grant, Sergeant Park, report received. We're en route to Fox Run. Is the suspect likely to flee? No, she wants the audience. She'll be standing in good light, smiling for someone's phone. 8:12, another call. We've located the item, left side of her dress. We're retrieving it now. My son is there too, agitated, confused, learning what I already know. Quiet women are not weak. We're documented. Photos, appraisals, insurance writers, paper that tells the truth, and a 3-word reply that started all of this. Enjoy. Because a thief who announces the crime doesn't deserve a scene. She deserves consequences. So, no, I didn't chase her into the ballroom. I sat at my table, poured tea, and watched the steam rise while the law did its job. And when the brooch came off her dress, the story you're about to hear began to sparkle in a very different light. Now, let me tell you who I am and how I was ready. I should tell you who I am before the scene gets crowded. My name is Eleanor Grant, but if you've sat in a school office in Naperville in any time in the last 30 years, you probably know me as Ellie at the desk. I was the voice who called to say your child left their math book at home and would you like to run it over, and the hands that kept the spare Band-Aids stocked and the lost and found organized. I married a man named Tom who loved 2 things more than anything: teaching me how to do the things people thought I couldn't, and quietly collecting small pieces of beauty. He taught me to check a sump pump without calling a neighbor, and to change a breaker without crying. He loved little things with history, the way a clasp works on a Victorian bracelet, the stamp on the bottom of an old silver spoon, the box hinge on a cigar case long after the cigars were gone. He never showed off. He cataloged. When we were first married, we kept our important papers in a shoebox under the bed. Then it became a metal file cabinet in the basement, and then a banker's box labeled with a neat G for Grant in Tom's engineer handwriting. That G folder is a universe of what we built. Appraisals, serial numbers, photographs with dates in the corner, copies of the insurance writers that are boring right up until they are not. We and Tom were never flashy. We drove the same Honda twice as long as we had to. He wore the same winter coat for 12 winters because it still kept him warm. Quiet doesn't mean you weren't paying attention. Tom is not here to see any of this. He died 6 years ago in late October while the oak tree in the backyard was doing that show-off trick with the red leaves. A stroke took him. 1 minute he was laughing at a joke I made about the neighbor's inflatable Halloween dragon, and the next minute he touched the back of his neck and said, "Ellie," like it mattered how I carried his name. We called 911, and then I called Jason, and then I sat in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights while men and women in scrubs moved with the urgency of purpose. We had 32 more hours, and then we didn't. If you've lost someone, you know that the paperwork is the part you get to do when the tears run out. There's comfort in a form that will be filled and a box that can be checked.
After the casseroles, after the bright tulips and vases I forgot to water, after the neighbor boys mowed my lawn without being asked, life narrowed to this: the oak table, a stack of envelopes, and my name written in 100 places like a dare. He had made me promise 2 things. First, don't move because you're lonely. Move when it makes sense. Second, learn the inventory so it doesn't all live in my head. If there was any poetry to be found in grief, it came from doing what he'd been quietly teaching me all along. I sat with the banker's box labeled G. I matched photos to items, descriptions to serial numbers, appraisals to insurance writers. It was not glamorous, but my heart learned to beat around a new shape. 3 years after Tom died, Jason and his wife, Madison, moved into my house. Don't start by judging me. Start by understanding the math. Their condo had a burst pipe. Their insurance was fighting them. The baby had just been born. They needed a place with a working washer and dryer and a backyard to put the portable swing. What I know now is that temporary is one of the slipperiest words in the English language. It can mean 3 weeks. It can mean 3 months. It can mean the rest of your life if you are not careful with the hinge of a yes. At first, it felt like a second chance. The house had been too quiet. Suddenly, there were little socks on my dryer and the ping of someone's phone in the hallway and the smell of coffee at 6:30 that wasn't mine. Madison came in hot with energy. She was the kind of woman who could plan a birthday party and a service project at church and a school supply drive without pausing to breathe. She wore the kind of clothes that never wrinkled and carried a tote with a monogram that matched the hand towel in the downstairs bathroom. People admired her. It made them feel like they too could master life if they just bought the right planner. It took me longer than it should have to realize that the things Madison admired needed to belong to her. She didn't say, your kitchen. She said, our kitchen, and then rearranged the cabinets. When I reached for the flour where it had lived for 23 years, it wasn't there. She moved the pot roast pan I loved to a high shelf I couldn't reach without a step stool. More efficient, she said, and I wondered how efficiency had become a synonym for someone else gets to decide. When the grandkids arrived the following year, 2 of them, a boy and a girl who turned the house back into a home I recognized, I made brownies on a Wednesday. Madison smiled like a newscaster and said, Eleanor, sugar before dinner is just not the best choice. We have fruit cups. She was probably right. She said it in the voice people use when they found a way to take your name and make it small. I noticed it first on birthdays. If it was mine, she planned something for Jason's work friends that fell on the same night. If the ladies from church wanted to take me out for soup and a salad, she suggested we loop it into something so it would feel less old-fashioned. I am not afraid of old-fashioned. Old-fashioned is how we got the oak table and the marriage that didn't quit even when we wanted to. The first thing that went missing was a cameo pin my father's sister left me. I am not careless. I put it on a small velvet tray on my dresser like I have for 40 years, a little habit that feels like respect. It wasn't there one morning. I patted the tray like it could tell me where it went. I emptied the jewelry box and then put things back one by one like you do when you don't want the truth to be what it is. I assumed I'd misplaced it because that story hurts less. Weeks later, I caught a whiff of something in my bedroom, vanilla and cedar, the exact scent the lotion Madison loved and had me smell at the mall. She said, "It smells cozy," and I smiled on cue. I had smelled cozy in the one room in this house that had always been mine. I told myself a new lie. She was looking for a Band-Aid, a safety pin, a hairbrush she left on the nightstand. It's a big house. We float through each other's spaces because family. That's what I told myself while I moved the curio cabinet key from the little dish behind the cookbooks to the third drawer under the phone. 2 days later, the key wasn't there. It turned up on the pantry shelf under the tin of cocoa, as if keys grow legs when we have too much else to carry. The sterling baby cup vanished 11 months before the text about the blue pin. I found an empty space on the hutch, and then a soft cloth folded too neatly where the cup had been. I went to the calendar and wrote a small note on the day. Not a threat, a fact. That is when I started putting dates on truths. I am not proud of how long I waited to call Ava. I could have called after the cameo. I could have called after the baby cup. But it felt like telling on someone to the principal when maybe you could just work it out at lunch. I told myself that even if something was happening, it was small, and who wants to be the kind of woman who can't share? Then one afternoon, I pulled open the top drawer of my dresser and found a little pile of dust along the back edge, the exact color of the velvet lining inside the brooch case Tom loved. Dust tells its own story, if you let it. I called Ava after I found the sticky note. It was stuck to a flyer Madison left on my kitchen counter next to the grocery list. Maple Ridge Senior Living. A new place with a bistro and a hair salon and a cheerful photo of someone my age laughing too hard at nothing. Madison had circled closer to Jason and 24-hour care. The sticky note said, "Jason, push the tour, easier before winter." I stood there long enough for the tea water to boil and then grow cold again. Ease is another slippery word. Easier for who? I went to my bedroom, reached behind the closet shelf for the banker's box labeled G, and lifted out the file for jewelry. There it was. The Tiffany brooch, a violet blue stone the color of evening from 1905, a piece that looks like something your grandmother wore to church until a good light catches it, and then you realize it's a universe trapped in a piece of glass. Tom had written G042 on the top corner of the photo, appraisal from a firm downtown, in a sleeve. Insurance writer stapled to a copy of the main policy. I held it all in my hands and felt a steadiness I hadn't let myself feel in years. I dialed Ava. She said, "You did the right thing. We'll start quietly. If nothing else happens, we'll call it nothing. If something does, we'll be ready." A month later, the text came from Madison. "Borrowing that old blue pin for the gala. Hope that's okay." In the time it took for the 3 dots on my phone to finish blinking, I realized the woman had just confessed without knowing the word for it. Borrowing implies asking. Hope implies doubt. She thinks she is telling a story where I am grateful she included me. I told a different story. I told the truth in 3 words. "Have fun, sweetheart." Then I called my attorney and used the words Tom left me like a map. Asset G042. I did not go to the gala. I boiled water for tea. I made myself a small plate of crackers and sharp cheddar and sat at the oak table where you either become visible or you disappear, and I chose visible. I thought about the first time I put on the brooch. We had just paid off the house the winter before, and we went to a little auction out past Aurora because Tom liked the rhythm of a bid caller. How ordinary people can put their hands up and own something beautiful for a price that wasn't an insult. The brooch looked tired in its velvet box under fluorescent lights. The glass case made everything look dull. Tom whispered, "This one has more to say." We took it to the window, tilted it toward daylight, and the stone lit like a small planet. We bid higher than we planned and drove home on Butterfield Road with the heater on low and that brooch in my lap under a napkin, like a bird we were keeping safe. That was the night Tom stopped at a diner and ordered hot chocolate for me because the waitress said they make it with real milk. And I laughed because I was 59 years old and felt like a girl. When we got home, he took photos for the file, made a copy of the appraisal, carried the insurance writer up from the basement, and slid everything into the sleeve labeled G042. We put the brooch in the safe, and then ate scrambled eggs on the couch because we spent the grocery money on a piece of history. People think you have to be rich to do it right. You mostly have to be stubborn.
At 8:12, the phone rang again. "Mrs. Grant, this is Sergeant Park. We've located the item at the Fox Run Country Club. The suspect is wearing it on the left side of her dress. We've got your filed report, the appraisal photo, and an image of your text exchange. We're retrieving the brooch now." "Thank you," I said. "Is my son there?" "He is. He's agitated but compliant." "That sounds like my son." "If you're comfortable, stay put," she said. "I'll call you when the brooch is secured." I hung up and looked at the empty spot on the hutch where the baby cup used to sit. It is an odd thing to measure relief against loss. I poured myself tea and carried it to the back door. The yard was dark. Sprinklers ticked on somewhere down the block. I wondered if the neighbors would hear anything about the country club or if they'd pretend they hadn't, like people do when comfort is on the line. The house phone rang at 8:37. Not many people have the number. Jason does. "Mom," he said, his voice already breaking the way a child's does when his body knows trouble before his head catches up. "What is going on? They're saying Madison stole a brooch worth more than $2 million. Mom, you don't have jewelry worth $2 million. "Your father did," I said, quietly as a prayer, and then he left it to me, along with a file cabinet, an attorney, and a plan he hoped we'd never have to use. "What collection? What plan? Mom, you work at an elementary school." "I worked at an elementary school. Your father worked at being careful, and so did I. Those are jobs, too." "You have to fix this," he said, and I could hear the way that sentence had served him since he was 8 and needed someone to sign a permission form. They brought officers into the ballroom. People are recording. Madison is crying. Her friends are seeing who she is. "I'll talk to you when you get home." "Mom, please." "I love you," I said. Then I hung up because that is a kind of love too. The doorbell rang at 9:10. Ava did not wait for me to invite her in. She moved through the entryway like a person who already knows where the light switches are. She spread a file on my table, appraisals, inventory printouts, a copy of my earlier notes about pieces gone missing and the dates they disappeared. A business card, paperclip to the top, said, "Leo Pappas, Investigation Services," just in case we needed someone to put on a blazer and talk to men who prefer the word consignment to pawn. "You did everything right," Ava said. "You kept records. You didn't go confront her in a ballroom. You let the paper speak and the law follow." "I let it go on too long," I said. "Maybe," she said. "Maybe you needed a line bright enough to see it from every angle. This," she tapped the file, "this is bright. We'll see where the state's attorney lands. In the meantime, there may be collateral fallout. Neighbors, church ladies, my son. All of the above," she said. "You don't have to take care of them right now." The phone rang again at 9:25. It was Sergeant Park. "The brooch is secured," she said. "We're holding it as evidence for now. Your daughter-in-law is being processed. She insisted you gave permission. We have the text. Hope that's okay is not permission. Miss Richardson is with you?" "She is," I said. "I'll contact you in the morning regarding a formal statement and a property receipt number. Try to get some rest, Mrs. Grant." "Thank you," I said. "You too." I did not sleep. I sat at the table with Ava until midnight while she explained bond hearings to me in plain English and told me what to expect at an arraignment. When she left, I washed 2 coffee mugs and set them in the rack like everything else was normal. In the quiet, I could hear Madison's words, like echoes in old pipes. "Eleanor, could you keep it down when you close cabinets? Eleanor, the grandkids don't need brownies. Eleanor, we should really tour a retirement place." It is a miracle and a sorrow when a woman finally hears her own voice louder than the chorus of everything else. Mine rose up in me like a healthy thing that had been hungry for too long. I whispered into my kitchen air, "No."
At 7:12 the next morning, my phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize. "If you think a pin is worth ruining our family, you're sicker than I thought." I read it twice before I realized it was from one of Madison's friends, a woman who wears skinny scarves and volunteers at the hospital twice a week. When people say, "our family," they often mean my comfort. I set the phone face down and cracked 2 eggs into a bowl. I made coffee with an extra scoop. Jason came home around 9, wearing last night's shirt, minus the tie, his hair flat where he must have run his hands through it again and again. He stood in the doorway to the kitchen like he had when he was 10 and broke a neighbor's window with a baseball. "Mom," he said. He looked older and younger at the same time. He looked like he might sit on the floor and cry. "Eat," I said, sliding a plate of eggs and toast across the table. "We'll talk after." He ate because his body knows me, and because the little boy in him recognized the cadence of instructions I'd repeated since 1988. He wiped his mouth, then turned the ring on his left hand like it held an answer. "She says you're making this up," he said. "She says you're confused." I slid a copy of the inventory printout across to him and placed my reading glasses on top. He put them on even though he didn't need them and read like he did when he was 8, moving his lips without sound. "Photos?" he asked. "In the file," I said. "The appraisals are there too." He flipped through pages until he found G042 and a printed copy of the photograph from the night we brought the brooch home, a younger version of my hands holding velvet like something fragile and fierce. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he set the paper down and looked at me like a man who finally realized the plank he was standing on had been sawn halfway through. "I didn't know," he said. "I know you didn't, but you saw me be shushed in my own kitchen." "I thought I was keeping the peace," he said. "Peace and silence are not the same thing." I said, "You're my son. This part is yours to carry. I can't carry it for you." At 10 o'clock, Ava called with the time for the arraignment. At noon, a woman named Cage from Bluebird Consignment in Lisle called Sergeant Park and then called Ava because she recognized a face. By 2, the detectives had printed out photos from a resale app where someone going by @West Suburb Chic had posted an estate find, sterling baby cup minimal wear, and a set of mother-of-pearl cufflinks that used to live in Tom's top drawer. The app has filters. You can filter for local pickup and for seller accepts cash. You can filter for lies if you know what you're looking at. Leo Pappas showed up at 3 in a tweed jacket that looked like it had a flask sewn into the pocket and laid a manila envelope on my table. I could tell from the weight it wasn't just photos. He slid out copies of consignment receipts from Bluebird, another place in Downers Grove, and a pawn shop on Ogden where the man behind the counter wore a shirt with his name on it and kept smiling for the camera like someone had taught him to be cheerful no matter what. Leo had screenshots of messages Madison sent to a River North jeweler asking about bluestone potential. She did not use the word sapphire. She didn't need to. A person who believes the world owes them doesn't always know the name for what they're taking. They just know it should be theirs. "I didn't want to be right," I said. "I didn't either." "People like her don't just wake up one day and decide to risk a felony," he said. "They practice on small things to see if anyone shouts." "Not this time. I'm shouting." Ava asked if I wanted to go to the arraignment. I did not. I live a mile and a half from the courthouse where everyone's worst day gets a number and a time. I stayed home and watered the fern hanging in the kitchen window. I tried to remember if I had always hated the way the light looked at 3 on a Friday, or if this was new. The fern didn't care. Plants keep living, even when you can't remember how to. At 5, Ava called with the judge's orders. No contact from Madison. The brooch held as evidence, a date set for a preliminary hearing. She told me to expect calls from people I didn't owe any explanations to. "You can say no," Ava said. "To everyone. That's a complete sentence." "Where will she go?" I asked. Not because I planned to fix it, but because my mind still wanted to know. "Her lawyer can figure that out. Not your problem."
That night, the neighborhood Facebook group lit up with the kind of curiosity people dress up with manners when they've got a bowl of popcorn and a story to tell. I didn't have Facebook. That was on purpose. The next morning, someone at church told me I should see the comments. I passed. I already knew what they would say. People who sided with me would ask for prayers and call me brave like they hadn't watched me be shushed for 4 years. People who sided with Madison would mention misunderstandings and how I was of a certain age and maybe confusion ran in families. I made myself a ham sandwich and sat on the back steps and watched a squirrel carry a whole slice of stale bread like it had stolen a treasure. We are all ridiculous and we are all holy. And sometimes the only way to tell the difference is to wait for the light to change. The search of Madison's closet happened on a Tuesday.
I did not attend. I did not want to watch strangers put their hands on my life. Later, Leo slid another envelope across the table. Inside were photos of a Ziploc bag of fob keys. One of them was the color and shape of the little key to my curio cabinet that had gotten legs 7 different times this year. There was also a spiral notebook with prices scribbled next to initials and arrows pointing to words like cup, frame, pen. The last photo was a stack of flyers. On top, Maple Ridge Senior Living, with a fresh second copy of the sticky note. Jason pushed the tour, easier before winter. I put my face in my hands and cried for the first time since the brooch was secured. Not because of what was gone, but because of what could have been. I saw myself in a too bright dining room where the mashed potatoes tasted like glue, pretending I didn't hear my own name from a nurse who had 12 other people to help before lunch. I saw Madison standing in my kitchen, putting my Dutch oven out of reach and calling it progress. I saw Jason looking down because looking up was too hard. I cried for the woman in that vision, and then I stopped because she was not me. The week before the preliminary hearing, I went to Butterfield's for pancakes with Ava because some conversations needed a table and warm maple syrup to be survivable. The smell of coffee and cinnamon is a kind of medicine. Ava tore her napkin into neat little squares while she explained what the state's attorney would likely do. We have theft by deception. We have evidence of prior sales. We have the text about the brooch. She has no priors, which will matter. She will beg for probation and restitution. The state will want some time inside and community service at minimum. We will push for something that tells the truth about harm. What does that look like? I asked. It looks like the judge hearing your voice, she said, if you're up for speaking on plea day. I am. It also looks like you deciding what closure means. Not legal closure, life closure. Life closure, I said, like I was trying on shoes. We ate pancakes. We made a list. People always ask what to do when they want the dramatic answer. Here's what you do. You print a list. You gather 2 friends. You sit at your kitchen table with a pen and a stack of paper, and you make an inventory of your life. You take photos with your phone and write down where things are. You make a copy and keep it with your insurance policy, and another copy with a person you trust who doesn't live under your roof. You keep your keys where you can reach them and where someone else can't. You stop saying you're making a big deal out of nothing when the only reason you're saying it is because it's easier for someone else. I started small. Wednesday mornings, 9 to 10, I made a pot of coffee and a tray of cinnamon rolls and told 3 friends from church to bring a notebook. We called it Check and Cheer because it sounded like I was inviting them into a battle and more like we were going to have a good time while getting something done. The first morning, we wrote down what mattered and where it was. Kay wrote, Dad's pocket watch, top dresser drawer. Marion wrote, pearls, top shelf shoebox. I wrote, safe, top closet shelf, code in Ava's envelope. We printed the list and put it in plastic sleeves. We laughed when I couldn't figure out how to make my phone stop auto-correcting Hutch to Hitch. We cried when Marion confessed she hadn't worn her wedding ring since Harold passed because the class feels like a decision now and she doesn't trust her own hands. I told them about sticky notes and country clubs and that oak table and how quiet eats the edges of women like us if we let it. By the 3rd Wednesday, we had 10 women crammed around my table, and I had to borrow folding chairs from the church closet. Someone brought lemon squares. A woman I didn't know knocked on the back door with a plastic file crate in her arms. She said she was invited by a friend who saw me quietly say on the bulletin board that I had copies of a form if anyone wanted one. It wasn't a movement. It was a checklist and a decision. The library called the week after that. They'd seen the small notice I tacked on the board next to a flyer for a quilting bee. The librarian asked if I'd be willing to hold a session in their community room. I said yes, on the condition that they put coffee in real mugs, because styrofoam tastes like the dentist. They laughed and said they'd find ceramic.
A local morning show heard about it and asked if they could film me at my table talking women through the basics. I agreed because the camera would point at the papers and not at my face. They mic'd me up, and I found myself telling a woman I'd never seen before that paper is the friend who won't forget you. She started to cry and blamed the onions she was cutting for dinner. We both knew it wasn't the onions. The day of the plea, the courtroom smelled like dust and peppermint. I wore a blue sweater because I am not above symbolism. Madison stood in a neat sweater with her hair pulled back and said the word guilty like it was foreign to her mouth. The state recited backs that sounded like someone else's life. An item appraised at $2.1 million, removed without permission, prior sales of smaller items without the owner's knowledge, a pattern of deception. Madison's lawyer made noises about family misunderstandings. The judge looked at the text message and the appraisal photographs, and then at me. "Do you want to speak, Mrs. Grant?" "I do," I said, and my voice didn't shake. "Go ahead." I did not write a poem. I wrote a grocery list of harm. You didn't just take a brooch. You took the oxygen out of my kitchen. You told a story in my house where I was silly and forgetful and in the way. You said fruit cups, like the words were a ladder to a place where you got to decide. You took small things first, the way people test fences before they jump them. You loved the feeling of deciding for me. You loved how it felt when I got smaller. I am not small. I am not silly. I am not confused. I am 68 years old, and I have cooked more pot roasts than you have years on the earth. And I have paid attention, and I am the one who knows where the good knives are. I am pressing charges because this is what we do when someone takes what is not theirs and calls it kindness. I am pressing charges because other women are watching, and they need words they can borrow. I forgive you enough to stop you. The judge sentenced her to felony theft by deception with a term that included restitution and time that wasn't just probation, and a 5-year no-contact order. The judge also let her keep her face. He didn't say a thing about who she had to be after the hearing or what story she had to tell herself at night. That is not a judge's job. That is a person's job. Jason stood in the hallway after and didn't try to hold my hand because he knew his hand would shake. He said, "I filed." "For divorce?" He nodded. I thought if I kept quiet, it would count as being a good husband. Turns out it counts as pretending not to see. You're learning. That counts. In the weeks that followed, life got very ordinary and very loud in new ways. The brooch came home in a sealed bag with a property receipt number on the top. Ava stood with me while I slipped it back into its sleeve with the photo and the appraisal. I wore it once, a month later, to a fundraiser at the Naperville Library because it felt right to put something beautiful in a place that teaches people to read the fine print. No one commented on the value. One woman in the powder room said she liked my pin. I told her it reminded me to pay attention. She nodded like that was a language we both knew and said, "I thought I was losing my mind. Turns out my son-in-law was helping with our downsizing. He's done helping now." We both washed our hands and used too many paper towels and laughed at ourselves for doing it. Check and Share moved to the library's community room with a sign-up sheet because I could no longer fit everyone around my table. The librarian made a handout with a little drawing of a file folder and the words "Household Inventory" on top in a font that made your brain relax. The Illinois Department on Aging asked if they could include the form in a mailer, and I said yes, as long as they printed it on paper thick enough not to tear when older fingers held it. Leo came once and tried to explain resale apps to a room full of women who had never sold anything online, and then a teenage girl from the church youth group showed up and translated the internet into English while she ate a donut. The girl showed us how to take good photo records and how to put them in a folder labeled in a way we would remember. She printed labels that said keys and made us all laugh by sticking one on her own forehead. People will tell you that healing is a straight line. It isn't. It's more like the way you stir batter when you're tired. Some circles are neat and some splash. I had days where I wanted to stand in my front yard and tell the first person who passed that my son didn't stand up for me in my own kitchen for too long. I had days where I bought a ridiculous houseplant because it had leaves that looked like stained glass, and I needed something to tend. I learned that I could say no to invitations that made my belly tighten. I learned to accept pie. There's a women's group in town that makes the best sour cream apple pie. If they bring you a pie, say yes. Let real sugar do what it does. Jason and I began to talk like two grown-ups who wanted to try again. He came by after work to sand and refinish Tom's workbench in the garage. We went to Ace Hardware together because some errands are easier when a person who remembers the aisle numbers is beside you. We stood in line behind a man buying salt for his driveway and a woman arguing about the price of a hose nozzle, and it felt like a miracle to have something so ordinary to do. At Christmas, we ate pot roast and green beans with almonds and didn't talk about the country club because it had already taken enough oxygen. We talked about the kids and how tall they were getting and whether the middle school band concert would be survivable. We talked about the first snow and whether the neighbor's inflatable dragon would survive the wind. We said grace without saying grace out loud. Sometimes a meal is the prayer. The morning show asked me to come back for an update. I brought the brooch but didn't wear it. I set it on the table beside the inventory sheet and said, I brought this because it's pretty in a way that makes you look twice. But the thing that did the rescuing was a piece of paper with a date on the top and a list in the middle. You don't have to be fancy. You don't have to be brave in public. Write it down. Tell one person you trust. If you're being shushed in your own kitchen, you're allowed to turn up your own volume. After the show in the lobby, a woman in her 50s with a nice blouse and worry under her mascara took my hand and said, I saw you. I made a list. My daughter-in-law found it and told me I was dramatic. I kept the list anyway. Yesterday, the police brought back my mother's ring. We stood there and squeezed hands like we were exchanging something more expensive than jewelry. 3 months after the plea, I got a letter from the state's attorney's office with a copy of the restitution schedule and a note that said the judge had upheld the no-contact order. I set it in the file with the brooch photo and closed the lid on the banker's box. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt like someone who had finished her chores and could sit down. Sometimes when people hear the story, they ask me what I would have done if Madison had apologized before the police found her at the country club. I tell them the truth you don't want to hear. She had 100 chances. I gave her 1,000. I don't need an apology that only shows up after someone else sees you. That's not remorse. That's public relations. If you're listening to this and your stomach just clenched because you are living with a person who says sorry like it's an umbrella they share only when it rains, I am going to say a sentence that you can put in your mouth and try on for size. No. But I am also going to tell you this. Forgiveness and boundaries are not enemies. I can want good things for Madison's life and still not let her in my kitchen. I can hope her heart grows in the quiet and still say, not here.
I put the brooch back on exactly once more. It was spring, and the library threw a little fundraiser to repair the steps and buy new bean bags for the children's reading corner. I pinned the brooch to my cardigan and walked through a room filled with people who pretend they have nothing to learn. A little girl pointed at my sweater and said, "Is that a flower?" I bent down and said, "It is a jewel that catches the light." She nodded like she knew things too and then tugged her mother's hand toward the book display. If there is justice in this world, it looks like a little girl pointing at a thing that almost ruined a family and calling it pretty because she has no idea what the stone had to hold. At the end of that night, a woman caught me by the bathroom sink and said, "My son sells my things on the internet and tells me I treat myself enough." She said it with a little laugh at the end, like she was apologizing for bringing it up. I told her to write what matters on a list and put a date at the top and tell one friend. I told her to take pictures.
I told her to call the Adult Protective Services number if she needed to, because sometimes the hardest part of being a mother is accepting that love does not look like saying yes to whatever a child wants. She began to cry. We both pretended it was the hand soap. In June, the check and cheer group had gotten so big that the library had to open a second room, and the teenagers from the youth group ran a photo booth where they took pictures of people's ring boxes and stamped silver hairbrushes on a clean background and labeled the files so they could find them later. I printed 50 copies of the form, and every single one walked out of the building with permanent ink on it. I went home and stood in my quiet kitchen and pinched the bridge of my nose and then laughed because I had read that trick in a magazine and it never did anything except make me look like I was thinking hard. On the 4th of July, Jason grilled in the backyard. The kids ran under the sprinkler, shrieking the way children do when they forget anyone's listening and then glance up to make sure you are. He handed me a plate with a burger and a slice of tomato thick enough to pass for generosity and said, "You know, I didn't notice how quiet you got. I thought you wanted quiet." I said, "I wanted peace, not to be shushed." He said, "We're learning." I said, "You are. I already learned it." He smiled like he could hear the teasing under the truth. We raised our paper cups of lemonade to nothing in particular and everything, and for the first time since the text slid onto my phone, the house felt bigger than the harm. In August, the morning show producer sent me an email asking if I would consider doing a little how-to video for older viewers on keeping household records. "No pressure," she wrote. "We can come to you. We'll blur anything you want blurred." I said yes, and they brought a tripod and a soft light and a microphone that made me look more important than anyone with a pot roast recipe needs to be. I sat at the oak table in a blue cardigan without the brooch and told the camera that cookies are good, but inventories are better. I told people to write down where things are, even if all you own are photographs and a quilt your mother made the summer you had your second baby. I told them to choose one friend to hold a copy of the list and to pick someone who loves them enough to tell them a hard truth. The video aired, and in the week after, our church phone rang itself hoarse from women asking if there were more forms. The pastor printed extra copies and put them in a basket by the narthex where the bulletins go. A man took one and looked around like he was stealing something. He wasn't. He was putting his head above water. No one talks about the part after, when the court case's edges dull and the neighborhood finds something new to chew on and the person who hurt you goes off stage and the audience leaves. No one talks about the space that opens where anger used to sit. I put a plant there. It was ridiculous and green, and the leaves looked fake until you touched them, and they weren't. I took the brooch out twice a year and looked at it under the kitchen light and said thank you to a man who taught me to check my sump pump and the breaker and my own voice. I kept teaching the Wednesday group until the library took it, and the library taught a woman in Aurora, who taught a woman in Romeoville, who taught a woman in Lisle. I said yes to pie and no to false peace. I learned the names of the neighbors' dogs. I bought new measuring spoons for the grandkids and told them they were allowed to still call me Mimi, even if their mother was no longer here to roll her eyes at it. I don't know what you will make of Madison's life. It isn't mine to assemble or fix. I heard through the grapevine that she cried at first and then got tight and then softer. And then she started telling a story to someone about being desperate, about wanting to be seen. I am not the person who gets to decide whether her story lands in the truth. I hope it does, because women who learn the truth about themselves get freer. And when one of us gets freer, the rest of us can exhale a little more. I hope she finds a job that makes her tired and a therapist who makes her cry, and friends who will tell her when she's out of line. I hope she never again calls help the word she uses when she wants to take something. I don't need to share a table with her to want those things. We can want good things for people we no longer let in the house. That is one of the ways you save your own life.
In October, a year after the text, I stood in the backyard under the oak tree that keeps showing off and whispered a thank you to a man with steady hands and a plan for everything. I imagined him laughing at the way I say words like writer and inventory now, like I was born to it. I imagined him watching me sit at the oak table with a dozen women and a plate of cookies, telling them that paper tells the truth and that their kitchen is theirs. I imagined him looking at the space at the hutch where the baby cup used to be, and then at the empty space in my chest where fear used to sit, and seeing the balance of it. We don't always get everything back. We get enough back to be ourselves again. If you're listening to me and you're standing in your kitchen with your hands on the counter because you can't think what to do next, I will tell you what I told the camera and what I told the librarian and what I told myself at the oak table. Write it down. Pick one person you trust and tell them the truth. Lock what you love and ensure what you can. Pay attention to your keys. Stop letting someone else tell your story while you stand in the room. If you are being shushed, raise your voice. If you are being called silly, call yourself by your name. If somebody tells you that a brooch is just a pin, tell them a ring is just a circle and a house is just lumber and the life is just days until you love it enough to say no. I can tell you how the story ends because I made the ending myself. The brooch sits in the safe behind the closet shelf in a velvet box under a folded dish towel because hiding in plain sight is as good a trick as any. The file labeled G lives on the top shelf where even I need the step stool. The oak table holds coffee and lists and crumbly lemon squares and elbows and laughter and the kind of silence that isn't about fear. Jason brings the kids over on Sundays. He knows where the good knives are now, and he asks if I want help and then actually listens to the answer. At Christmas, the house smells like oranges and cloves and roast, and no one tells me I'm too loud closing a cabinet. In the spring, the librarian calls about the bulletin board because the push pins keep disappearing, and we laugh because some thefts are harmless and some are not. In the summer, the hydrangeas bloom, and I cut a few to put in a jar on the table, and they look like pom-poms for a team I didn't know I needed to join. The last time I wore the brooch, a woman in a denim jacket stopped me in the hallway at the library and said, "That is the prettiest thing I've ever seen." "It is," I said. "It catches the light. So do you," she said. And then she blushed like she'd said something too big for a hallway. I went home and set the brooch on the table and watched the way the kitchen light found it and made it brighter. The stone didn't do anything. It sat there and let the light do its job. That is what I'm trying to do now. Sit where I'm supposed to sit. Let the light find me. Let the truth be as ordinary and bright as a piece of paper with the date at the top and a list in the middle and my name written the right size.